The uncomfortable truth. Most people believe they spent years in school in order to learn. They assume that time was an investment in knowledge, intellectual growth, and preparation for adult life. This belief is so widely accepted that it is rarely examined. It is repeated by parents, educators, governments, and institutions as an obvious truth, almost a natural law. But there is a detail that is seldom questioned. If the true purpose of school were to teach people how to think, if its central aim were to cultivate independent judgment, lasting curiosity, and intellectual autonomy, the adult world would look very different. We would see people comfortable with uncertainty, capable of asking difficult questions without fear of being wrong, willing to learn on their own without needing constant instructions, permission, or external validation. We would see adults who do not confuse rules with morality, who do not wait for approval before acting, who can sustain their own ideas even when those ideas are unpopular. But this is not what we observe. What we see, consistently, is something else. We see adults uneasy with freedom, anxious when there is no clear script to follow, uncomfortable making decisions without institutional backing. We see people who are highly credentialed, yet dependent, educated, yet hesitant, informed, yet unsure of their own judgment. This is not an individual failure. It is a collective pattern, a pattern that raises an uncomfortable question. Perhaps school has been remarkably successful, just not in the way we were told. Perhaps the most important lessons were not mathematics, history, or language. Perhaps they were quieter, deeper, and far more permanent. How to wait, how to comply, how to adapt to external structures even when they make little sense. What we see are not poorly educated adults. We see carefully trained ones, trained to follow, trained to accept, trained to confuse conformity with maturity. And this changes the question entirely. It is no longer a matter of whether school works, but of asking, honestly, what does it work for? What school actually teaches? To understand what school truly teaches, it is necessary to look beyond the subjects and examine the structure itself. From the earliest years, the child enters an environment governed almost entirely by external control. Time is divided for them. Movement is regulated. Speech is permitted or restricted by signal. Curiosity is allowed only when it aligns with the schedule. None of this is presented as training. It is presented as normal. The child quickly learns that learning does not happen when interest appears, but when the bell rings. That questions are not asked because they matter, but because they are appropriate at that moment. That progress is not measured by understanding, but by compliance with instructions. Over time, a subtle lesson is absorbed. The most important skill is not thinking deeply, but adjusting behavior to expectations. Success becomes associated with following directions precisely. Failure becomes associated not with misunderstanding, but with deviation. In this environment, independence is not directly discouraged. It is simply made impractical. There is rarely time to linger on an idea, rarely space to pursue a question fully, rarely permission to challenge the framework itself. What develops instead is a habit. The habit of waiting to be told what matters. The habit of organizing one's attention around external demands. The habit of equating authority with correctness. This is not accidental. A system that manages large populations efficiently cannot rely on self-directed individuals. It relies on predictability. And predictability is achieved not through understanding, but through repetition, supervision, and evaluation. Grades, rankings, and standardized benchmarks reinforce this logic. They teach students to locate their value outside themselves, to measure worth through approval, to see learning as performance rather than exploration. By the time schooling ends, the lesson is deeply internalized. Thinking is allowed, but only within boundaries. Creativity is welcomed, but only when it is useful. Autonomy is praised in theory, but postponed indefinitely. What school teaches most effectively is not a subject. It is a posture of waiting, of adapting, of accepting structure as inevitable. And once that posture is learned, it rarely disappears on its own. John Taylor GATTO approached schooling not as a theory, but as an observation. He spent decades inside classrooms, not speculating about what school might be, but watching what it consistently produced. What he noticed was simple and unsettling. Modern schooling was not designed primarily to cultivate intelligence or wisdom. It was designed to manage populations. GATTO argued that mass schooling emerged alongside industrial society, at a time when large systems required reliable, compliant, and predictable individuals. Factories, bureaucracies, and centralized institutions could not function if people were deeply self-directed or intellectually independent. So schooling adopted a different priority. Instead of nurturing judgment, it trained habits. Instead of encouraging autonomy, it rewarded obedience. Instead of developing inner discipline, it imposed external control. According to GATTO, this was not a hidden conspiracy. It was an open design choice. A system meant to educate millions at once must value uniformity over individuality, efficiency over depth, order over meaning. Within such a system, the content becomes secondary. What matters most is not what students learn, but how they learn to relate to authority, time, and themselves. They learn that important decisions are made elsewhere, that their role is to comply, not to question. That evaluation comes from above, not from internal standards. GATTO often emphasized that schooling teaches people to fragment their lives, to divide learning into subjects disconnected from reality, to divide time into artificial units, to divide identity into roles assigned by institutions. This fragmentation weakens the individual's sense of coherence. It becomes harder to see oneself as a whole, self-directing person, easier to accept guidance, supervision, and instruction as permanent necessities. From GATTO's perspective, the most damaging lesson of school is not boredom or misinformation. It is dependence. Dependence on authority to define value. Dependence on systems to provide direction. Dependence on credentials to justify existence. In this light, schooling does not fail to produce free thinkers. It succeeds at producing manageable ones. And once that outcome is understood, many of the system's contradictions suddenly make sense. Real-life examples. The effects of schooling do not end at graduation. They become more visible. In the workplace, many adults hesitate to act without explicit instructions. They wait for approval before making decisions, even in situations that require judgment rather than permission. Initiative is often described as a risk, not a responsibility. Meetings multiply. Procedures expand. Documentation replaces understanding. This is not because people lack intelligence. It is because they have been trained to associate safety with compliance. In credential-based systems, years of learning are compressed into symbols, degrees, certificates, titles. These credentials rarely measure wisdom or competence. They measure endurance within a structure. The individual who follows the rules longest is rewarded with legitimacy. The individual who learns independently, outside sanctioned pathways, is often invisible. Consider how adults respond to uncertainty. When instructions are unclear, anxiety increases. When rules change, confusion follows. When authority is absent, many feel unanchored. This discomfort is not natural. It is learned. From early schooling, people are conditioned to believe that meaning comes from external structure, that tasks are valuable because they are assigned, that effort matters only when it is evaluated. Even creativity becomes performative. Ideas are shaped not by curiosity, but by expectations. Innovation is allowed, but only when it fits existing frameworks. Original thinking is praised after it succeeds, never before. Notice also how failure is treated. Mistakes are not seen as part of learning. They are recorded, ranked, and remembered. Over time, this produces caution rather than growth. Adults carry this with them. They avoid experimentation. They fear public error. They prefer instructions to exploration. None of this requires coercion. The training has already occurred. The habits formed in school quietly reproduce themselves in adult life. In offices, in institutions, in personal decisions. What appears to be maturity is often compliance refined over time. And what appears to be freedom is frequently just a wider set of rules. Psychological and social consequences. When obedience is practiced consistently over many years, autonomy does not disappear. It becomes unfamiliar, not forbidden, not punished directly, simply uncomfortable. People trained within rigid structures learn to associate safety with clarity imposed from outside. Clear instructions feel reassuring. Open situations feel threatening. Uncertainty, which is the natural condition of real learning, is gradually reinterpreted as a problem to be avoided. Choice begins to feel heavy rather than liberating. Freedom feels like exposure instead of possibility. Over time, individuals internalize an external voice, a supervisory presence that no longer needs to exist physically. They evaluate themselves the way they were once evaluated, through metrics, through comparison, through approval. The internal question shifts. Not, does this make sense? But, will this be accepted? This produces a subtle but powerful form of dependence. Confidence becomes conditional. Worth becomes measurable. Identity becomes unstable, because it is no longer anchored internally. People hesitate to trust their own judgment. They seek validation before acting. They confuse structure with stability, and guidance with truth. Socially, this produces populations that are easy to organize, but difficult to awaken. People continue following systems even when those systems clearly contradict lived experience. They accept inefficiency, boredom, and meaninglessness as normal conditions of adult life. They confuse endurance with virtue. John Taylor GATTO observed that this was not merely an educational issue, but a psychological one. Schooling trains people to live in fragments. Work exists over here. Learning exists over there. Purpose is postponed to some undefined future. The result is not ignorance. It is disconnection. The normalization of inner conflict. One of the least visible outcomes of prolonged schooling is the normalization of internal conflict. People leave school with a vague sense of unease. They feel capable, yet uncertain. Educated, yet directionless. Free, yet hesitant. This tension is rarely addressed directly. Instead, it is reframed as a personal issue. A lack of motivation. A failure of discipline. An individual shortcoming. Schooling does not help individuals resolve this contradiction. It trains them to tolerate it. From an early age, students are asked to perform tasks whose meaning is deferred. They are told the relevance will appear later, in the next grade, in the next credential, in adulthood. This postponement becomes a habit. Purpose is delayed. Understanding is secondary. Completion is what matters. Over time, people learn to function without coherence. They separate action from meaning, effort from intention, activity from purpose. The inner conflict fades from conscious awareness, but it does not disappear. It becomes background noise, a quiet dissatisfaction that is difficult to articulate and easier to ignore. Schooling does not create confusion by accident. It creates individuals who can live with it. Silence is almost absent from environments shaped by schooling. From early childhood, attention is constantly directed, managed, and corrected. There is always an objective to meet, a task to complete, a signal to follow. Time is filled deliberately, not to deepen understanding, but to prevent unsupervised thought. When direction disappears, discomfort often emerges, not because something essential is missing, but because something unfamiliar has appeared. Without instructions, many feel exposed. Without evaluation, uncertain. Without a defined objective, unsure how to proceed. This reaction is not a personal flaw. It is a learned response. A system that fills every moment with guidance never allows individuals to encounter themselves without mediation. Every question is pre-framed, every answer anticipated, every deviation corrected. In silence, none of this exists. There is no authority to defer to, no rubric to satisfy, no schedule to obey. Only awareness remains. And for many, awareness feels unstable. Schooling conditions people to experience value externally. Worth is assigned. Progress is measured. Meaning is approved. When that external structure is removed, a void seems to appear, not because there is nothing within, but because internal reference points were never cultivated. Silence exposes this dependence. It reveals how unfamiliar it feels to sit with a thought without immediately resolving it, to remain with uncertainty without seeking instruction, to exist without performance. Silence does not produce confusion. It reveals it. And because schooling rarely allows this encounter, many adults learn to avoid silence altogether. They replace it with noise, with activity, with constant stimulation, not out of preference, but out of discomfort. Silence threatens a system built on direction, because in silence, obedience has nothing to attach itself to. Subtle call to attention. At this point, nothing needs to be added quickly. No conclusion needs to be reached. What matters is noticing what has already appeared. If these observations feel familiar rather than surprising, that familiarity itself is significant. Recognition often arrives quietly, not as agreement, but as a subtle sense that something unnamed has finally been described. Many people sense that schooling shaped them in ways that go beyond subjects or grades, but lack a language to articulate how. They experience the effects without the framework. This channel exists to provide that framework, not to persuade, but to clarify. If these reflections resonate with you, consider subscribing, not as a routine, not for motivation or productivity, but as a quiet alignment with the idea that education should cultivate judgment, not compliance. Subscribing here is not about consuming content. It is about sustaining a space where these conversations can continue without simplification. And if you know parents, teachers, students, or anyone still involved in shaping how learning is understood. Consider sharing this, not as an argument, not as a warning, but as an invitation to observe. Some ideas do not spread through urgency. They spread through repetition, through familiarity, through the slow realization that what once felt normal deserves re-examination. Change of this kind is rarely loud. It happens quietly, in how people begin to interpret their own experiences. Reframing responsibility. Responsibility is commonly understood as obedience, as correct behavior within established rules, as fulfilling assigned duties without deviation. This definition is familiar because it is taught early. In school, responsibility means arriving on time, completing tasks as instructed, meeting externally defined standards. Judgment is rarely required. Interpretation is discouraged. Initiative is often mistaken for disruption. Over time, this association becomes internalized. Responsibility stops meaning the ability to respond thoughtfully to reality, and becomes the ability to follow procedures correctly. This shift has lasting consequences. As adults, many people feel responsible only when they are told what to do. When instructions are clear, they function well. When rules are absent or ambiguous, hesitation appears. Self-direction feels abstract. Authority feels concrete. Taylor GATTO argued that this confusion weakens self-governance. A population trained to obey rules will struggle to act independently when rules fail to address reality. This explains why freedom often feels overwhelming rather than empowering. Why autonomy is perceived as risk. Why many actively seek structure even when it limits their judgment. Responsibility, when reduced to compliance, no longer develops character. It produces reliability without discernment, efficiency without purpose, order without understanding. And when responsibility is outsourced to systems, individuals lose the habit of responding directly to life as it is. The unresolved question: if obedience can be taught quietly, over years, until it feels natural, then autonomy cannot be accidental. It cannot emerge simply because schooling ends. It cannot appear automatically with age, credentials, or employment. Autonomy requires practice. It requires trust. It requires space. Yet schooling provides very little of any of these. If formative years are spent learning how to wait, how to comply, how to seek approval before acting, then something else must be responsible for the development of self-governance. But where does that happen? There is no formal transition, no clear moment when responsibility shifts inward, no institution that announces the end of dependency. Most people are simply released from schooling and expected to function independently. The expectation remains, but the preparation does not. This unresolved gap explains much of modern adult life. People are told they are free, yet feel uncertain without guidance. They are told to think critically, yet hesitate without approval. They are told to take responsibility, yet wait for permission. Taylor GATTO suggested that this was not a failure of individuals, but a predictable outcome of the system itself. A system that trains obedience cannot easily produce autonomy. So the question is not whether people are capable of self-direction. The question is whether they were ever allowed to practice it. And if autonomy is never taught, never trusted, never modeled, what kind of society does prolonged schooling actually prepare us for?